Hello, hello. 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 There we go. Welcome everybody. It's really lovely to see so many people coming here today. My name's Francine Wolfish. I'm a journalist with Mail Online and also former features editor at Jewish News. And I'm joined today by the lovely Pam Fox. This is actually my fourth session I worked out with Pam. Pam is a social historian. When I say she researches her books, she really researches her books. They really are wonderful if you want to know about the social history of British Jewry. She's written books about Golders Green. She's written books about liberal Judaism, and you've written books about Bournemouth as well. So today, of course, we're talking about blooms. Now, I'm hopeful that most of us have a memory or have been to blooms, but just let's do a quick poll. How many of you actually went to blooms while it still was around?
Oh my goodness.
Good, we're in the right place. We're in the right place.
An informed audience.
That's always a good start. So I also have memories of blooms, lovely, fond memories of blooms. It was the place, the restaurant that they had in Golders Green. It was the place that my family went very much on special. It was that special occasion kind of restaurant where both my grandmothers were together in a room. I don't think I ever saw them anywhere else together other than when we went out together in blooms. But there was one particular memory I want to start with, which unfortunately didn't make it into the book, which is a real shame, but it's a good story, so stick with me. We were going to blooms together. I had just the one grandmother by that point, and she was being a little bit slow, walking along. Not that she was a dodderer, but for some reason she was doddering that day. And so the rest of my family had rushed into blooms to grab their table, obviously. And I was at the back, and I kind of went up to the door in Golders Green. If you remember, it was quite a sort of narrow kind of entrance way into the restaurant. Anyway, I just remember pushing open this door, possibly with a little bit more force than I should have, and didn't realise that I knocked this quite petite lady backwards as I got into the restaurant, and I thought, oh my goodness, I've just got to knock someone down. That's a good start. She was with a friend, and as she sort of got herself back up on her feet, I noticed first of all the very big dark beehive hairstyle that she had. You might be guessing already who this might have been, and the thick heavy makeup. And yes, it was Amy Winehouse. And she looked like she wanted to punch me, but luckily her salt beef on rye was ready just at that moment. So she collected that, I apologised, and went on with my meal.
Saved by the salt beef.
Sorry?
Saved by the salt beef.
Saved by the salt beef, literally. So that was one of my lovely memories of blooms. But Pam, why don't we start really? Why did you want to write a book about blooms?
Well, I suppose the short answer is because nobody else had. I couldn't believe it when I first started looking at blooms as a possible book, my next project. And there was virtually nothing written about it at all. There were sort of short articles, there were posts on Facebook.
It's talking, you really need to use the mic. I would use the mic.
How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, let's work with that one. So, further in I got into the research for the book, I realised what a compelling story it was, and just completely perplexed that nobody had written about it before. It was a bit like when I wrote the Golders Green book, and I had the same kind of surprise when I moved to Golders Green and was looking for a book about Golders Green Jewish community, and there wasn't one. So I thought, that's me. I suppose the other point that I'd like to make about writing this book is when I started out, I thought I was going to be writing about a restaurant, or in fact 2 restaurants. But the further I got into the project, it really became evident it wasn't just about the restaurants, it was also about the factory. It was a huge undertaking, and it wasn't just the source of a lot of profit for the Bloom family, but actually it served a huge part in supporting Jewish life up and down the country. So the book equally covers not just the restaurants, but also the manufactured goods as well.
And tell us a little bit about the research you did, because you did speak to members of the Blooms family as well, didn't you?
I did. I worked very closely with several members of the Blooms family, and that was absolutely vital because they gave me insights to the dynamic of the family, which I couldn't have got otherwise. And they're also like a quality control mechanism as well. As I wrote things, and they said, not quite right. And it's really good to get that kind of feedback from people. But I think the 3 main sources, other than the family, were these. First of all, I did a huge round of interviews for the book. I interviewed about 120 different people to get their stories and anecdotes. And some of them, the people I spoke to, were wonderful storytellers, and you'll see that in the book. There's some lovely anecdotes. A second source was social media. A few years ago, I wrote the history of the Rinkoff Bakery in the East End, and that's the first time I'd used social media as a possible source of information, and I was so pleased with what I got. I've been using it ever since, but not to the same extent that I have now with the Blooms book. You probably know that there are dozens of Facebook pages dedicated to the East End, its history, from things like Memories of Hessel, Bethnal Green, things like I Grew Up in the East End, etc. And they were just a wonderful source of information for the book. And the third source, which might not be so apparent, is the Jewish Chronicle. Love it or hate it, it has the most wonderful archives. And when I did a search of the Jewish archives, I got nearly 11,000 hits on Blooms, and you can't imagine, it wasn't, it was a whole array of material, from things like adverts for Blooms over the years, editorials about its development, and even things like the sort of hatched and matched columns were great as a source of information about what was happening. And put those all together, and you've got a really, really kind of sound basis. But I did have to do a lot of secondary research as well on the background to what I was writing about, particularly for the specialist chapters. Like I've got a chapter on food, and so there was a lot of special books on that. But also, the stories themselves don't tell the tale. You need a lot of other material to knit them all together to make them into a coherent narrative. So that's research.
Now, I think it's fair to say, you know, Blooms became a sort of a gastronomic dynasty, almost, didn't it? And these things don't just happen overnight. These things have to happen at the right time with the right people. So can you just talk us through a little bit about the family who was behind it, and why that time in particular was ripe for it to become such a success?
Remind me if I forget the second part of the question. So first of all, about the Bloom family. Maurice Bloom, who set up Blooms, came to the country in about 1910 from Lithuania. He initially worked for an already established butchery, and the family story goes is that he slept on sacks at the bottom of the butchery while he earned enough to get money together to set up his own firm. And in 1920 he married his wife Rebecca, who came from Poland, and together they founded the firm. And I make a big thing in the book about how close a partnership it was. It wasn't just Morris, it was Rebecca as well. Right from the beginning, they were partners. But more than that, also other members of the wider family were involved in the firm all the way down the line. As I describe it, it was a family firm. The firm was the family, and the family was the firm. They were closely intertwined. And actually, it went down 4 generations before Golders Green Restaurant actually closed in 2010. It closed. The timing you asked about was really ripe because things were changing in the East End. There had been a very, very large Jewish community, but come to the early 1920s, it was already beginning to disperse to other parts of London, leaving behind a much more working class Jewish community and generally poorer than it had been previously. So why it was ripe was that there were lots of hungry mouths to feed. But it wasn't just a matter of timing, it was also about how Rebecca and Morris were tuned in to the people they were wanting to feed. As relatively recent immigrants themselves, they understand where their customers came from and knew what they wanted. And what they wanted was big portions of tasty food, sold at a moderate price, easy to eat, and open and available at all hours. And they really got that formula right, and that's why it took off, because they understood their customers so well. And Morris was a very astute businessman. He not only knew what his customers want, but also knew how they changed over time, and that's why you get the very big change in the Bloom's history at the beginning of the 1930s, when he opened his state-of-the-art factory in Wentworth Street, and what had been a little neighbourhood cafe moved into much bigger premises and became what he now called a restaurant.
Thank you. So, obviously, let's talk about the food, because after all, that's what Bloom's was known for. I think, the title of your book, Noshtalgia, it sort of touches on the fact that people were looking for nostalgia, weren't they? That sort of hearkening back to where they had come from, which was mostly Eastern Europe. There's a lovely page here, quote here on this page. I'm just going to go to it. So one former diner, as she sort of recorded it, she said, "When the food arrived and I took my first bite, a wave of Jewishness washed over me like a tide. The food gave me a sense of identity I have found in few other places. I was eating my family's history."
It's actually amazing, cute. As a historian, when I heard tales like that, it really kind of sent a shiver up my spine, because it really kind of touches on the essence of what Bloom's was about. A lot of people went there, and as they ate, they not only heard about what it was they were eating, which they might not otherwise have got, but also the social conditions that created it as well. So it's a very powerful statement. About the food in the beginning, what's interested me is that a lot of the people who were Bloom's first customers were people who had come to this country to a large extent because they were hungry. Back in Eastern Europe, food for many of them had been quite scarce. Their diet was both monotonous and stodgy. So that's what impelled a lot of people to come here. But what they got at Bloom's was actually something a bit different. Yes, there were the kind of things that people might have eaten back in Eastern Europe, but also some very new types of food, the likes of which they wouldn't have seen before, such as the Vienna sausages, which would until then mainly have been eaten by Jews in the central part of Europe, and the great wadges of salt beef back in Eastern Europe. Meat was very scarce indeed, and suddenly here they were, almost in a land of plenty when they got to Bloom's.
Now there's some lovely menus you can look through in the actual book. It's sort of eye-popping, the kind of variety of stuff, but also the pricing. You could get hot salt beef with Viennas, so with Viennas, that's for 85p, and you could get a portion of chopped liver for 20p, which is quite amazing as well. But the food was not particularly healthy, was it? And the quantities, as you were saying, that people ate were quite legendary. I'm just going to go to another quote from the book. So this is in 1964, Jewish Chronicle writer Tracy Miller reported, "I once dined with a Mancunian visiting London. He insisted on going to Bloom's, so Bloom's it was. My friend worked his way steadily through the menu. Lokshen soup, a plate of salt beef with sweet and sour cucumbers, chips, lokshen pudding, and coffee. Hardly able to move at the end of his meal, he suddenly remembered he'd missed out on a course, and calling the waiter over, ordered a portion of chopped liver, concluding a very palatable meal with an hors d'oeuvre."
That's great. Yes, it's one of the things that sticks out. I mean, the portions were gargantuan, I would call them, but there were, I think, social reasons why people loved these ginormous amounts of food. To begin with, the people that I mentioned just now, the kind of first arrivals, were struggling really hard to establish themselves, working long, long hours, and they really needed those calories big time. During the war, Bloom's managed to stay open and served meals round the clock, and it was quite a kind of sanctuary for Jews who disproportionately were affected by the war. It was sort of like a beacon that drew people in throughout the war. And then a bit later, after the war, I think it was a bit of comfort eating, having been through the war, the Holocaust, the tensions surrounding the setting up of the State of Israel. The big portions really appealed to people that are finding it quite hard. And then a bit later on still, as people became assimilated into British society, as they became more affluent, it was a kind of a feedback as to where people had got to. It was sort of really satisfying for people to feel that they could eat these giant portions they'd done so well for themselves going to Bloom's.
Now, it wasn't just the food. That's not the only reason why people went to Bloom's. It was the waiters, let's be honest. Everybody loved the waiters, or they hated the waiters, or they loved hating the waiters. We've got quite a few great quotes here, so we're just going to go to those. Right, so I've just got a few here. They're all wonderful. So one writer summed up the phenomenally grumpy waiters as follows: bickering, grumbling, confronting, insulting, and seemingly affronted by the very fact you'd chosen to eat there. It was like being served by a coterie of particularly stroppy cab drivers whom you've asked to take you to South London. Okay, we've got another one here. So Nicole Schlagman had a great story here as well. Many years ago, I was in Bloom's with my husband. When he ordered the mixed grill, the waiter advised the steak, which he said was particularly good. My husband still ordered the mixed grill. When the waiter arrived with the food, it was the steak. There can't be many restaurants where the waiter decides what you're going to eat. There was another one, just skipping through, there's another ex-diner, as it were, who said, the waiter told them, you're fat enough, you don't need to eat anymore. And then there's another sort of great story here as well. One hot summer evening, my husband and two friends decided we really needed a good Heimische meal at Bloom's and Golders Green. That evening, we each ordered the house specialty, salt beef, Lutkers, and the works. The waiter, in his own time, plonked a jug of tepid water on the table, at which point we asked for some ice. We waited 5 minutes and reminded him about the ice. He confirmed it was coming. Another 5 minutes, and another reminder. Yes, it's coming, we're busy. We were getting hotter and hotter, especially under the collar. After a quarter of an hour or so, a bowl of rice turned up on the table. We said, sorry, but we didn't order rice, where's the ice? The waiter responded, sorry madam, there is no ice, so I bought you rice. We had no words. Pam, tell us about the waiters, for which you've actually dedicated an entire chapter. A whole chapter to the waiters. Tell us about the waiters.
Oh, this was such a fun chapter to write, and the stories were endless. And it seemed, when I did my research, that this was long-standing. It wasn't a kind of, just a briefing on. Right from the get-go, I was told that the waiters were the stars of the shows. Before their war, they were known to be the kind of in-house comedy act, a free-floor show as people ate, as it were. And then after the war, they seemed to sort of take that to extremes and became the very rude people that everybody remembers with such relish. The thing about them is they were rude to everybody. They didn't discriminate. It didn't matter what your station in life, you got the same treatment from the waiters. What I also found interesting was how this was passed down from one generation of waiters to another. To start with, there were mainly Jewish waiters, of course, but very soon after the Second World War, they became more and more diverse. I think in particular people remember some of the Greek Cypriot waiters for Bloom's, and I was described it as almost like a lesson from the Talmud being passed down from the Jewish waiters to the Greek waiters. Yeah.
And we had one as well, who had something funny on his name badge.
Yes. Does anybody remember the head waiter? He was latterly at Bloom's in Golders Green, called Leon Nicholas. A lot of people remember him. And by the time, he'd retired just before Bloom's closed in 2010, and he'd worked for about 40 years for Bloom's by then. But because he'd done it so long, his name badge, where previously said Leon, the N had dropped off. So everybody thought that he was Leo rather than Leon.
Now, the waiters were so legendary, weren't they, that they inspired a whole host of jokes. There were actual sort of Bloom's waiters jokes. I've got a few here. Customer, I asked for my steak to be rare and it was well done. Waiter, thank you sir, we always aim to please. Bloom's waiter, would you like dinner? Customer, what are my choices? Waiter, yes or no. Bloom's restaurant often used to get groups of Jewish bubbers coming into the restaurant to eat. So what did the waiter ask them? Is anything okay? And then, this is quite a funny one as well. 6 months after Bloom's waiter died, his widow went to see a medium, since she had promised her husband she would try to contact him in the great beyond. During the séance, the widow was sure she saw her husband standing in the corner of the room, dressed in his waiter's outfit. "Arnold," she cried, "come closer and speak to me." A ghostly voice drifted from the corner. "I can't, it's not my table." So lovely memories there of the waiters. So we've done the food, we've done the waiters, and then of course we come to the customers themselves, of whom a lot of us were those customers. But there is one great quote here. I'm just going to go to it. So, while I think most customers were well behaved, but there was a sort of a perception, perhaps not all customers were well behaved. Jack White contributed this story. A man was eating chicken in Bloom's, and he picked up the chicken in his hands and started noisily biting large lumps. One of the waiters said, "Please, sir, don't eat like that. You're upsetting the other customers." The coarse customer replied, "Don't worry, I've got permission to eat like this." "How come?" asked the waiter. "Well," replied the customer, "last week I was at a wedding at the Savoy. I was eating chicken as I am today, and the posh waiter said, 'We at the Savoy do not allow such behaviour. In Bloom's, you can eat like that.'" So that was your sort of your average customer. But then we had some celebrity customers as well. So,
We certainly did.
Pam, if you can
Okay.
tell us about the customers.
So I think it was really not until after the Second World War when the Bloom's restaurant opened in Whitechapel High Street near Aldgate East Station, it started to attract. In 1960, Sidney Bloom, who owned the restaurant by then, put up a big sign outside saying, "The most famous kosher restaurant in Great Britain." I think it was slightly premature, but only slightly. Within a few years, everybody was piling into Bloom's. I think the core was probably multi-generational families who went there and sat at the big tables at the back of the restaurant. But there were some very prominent people. And if I can do a roll call, Fran. So they fell into two categories. The famous people were mostly Jewish people to start with, and the names included Dustin Hoffman, Barbara Streisand, the Marx Brothers, Ron Moody, Alan Sugar, Elkin Allen, Ronnie Scott, Donald Pleasance and Warren Mitchell. And also some people that had grown up in the area, like Lionel Bart and Joe Loss. Joe Loss was actually the person that played at the opening of the Bloom's restaurant in 1952. And there are people from other walks of life as well, like Jewish MPs. Gerald Kaufman was a regular diner. And then there were royalty too. Princess Diana and Princess Margaret both dined at Bloom's. And much to Sidney Bloom's delight, Bobby Moore, and on occasion, the whole of the Tottenham Spurs football team. And then, over time, word got around and non-Jewish people started to come to Bloom's too, like Elizabeth Taylor, with Eddie Fisher and Richard Burton, not at the same time. Tom Cruise, Telly Savalas, John Cleese, Barbara Windsor, Huey Green, Dickie Henderson, Arthur Askey and Donald Sutherland. And there are also the pop stars of the moment. I don't know if people remember Mark Bolan, who sadly dined at Bloom's the night before he died in a car crash. And Cliff Richard, the story goes that his fans were so eager to get at him eating in Bloom's that they almost broke the plate glass windows. And also more politicians. Tony Blair went there. He treated his father-in-law, Tony Booth, 2 meals there. And Charlie Chaplin was a regular diner at Bloom's. So there you are.
And Amy Winehouse as well. Yeah, I had the actually the privilege of speaking to her father years later after she died, Mitch Winehouse, and he confirmed that she was a regular at the Bloom's restaurant in Golders Green. So there we go. Now, obviously, Bloom's popularity was legendary. I just look around this room and we can see we all got smiles on our faces because we do remember Bloom's. There was actually an anecdote in here about a couple who drove down from Manchester on the day that the M1 opened, just so that they could dine at Bloom's and go back again, which is quite incredible. And the front cover of the book, which you can see over here, this lovely painting here by Beverly Jane Stewart, who's with us today, just sort of shows the hustle and the bustle, people of all walks of life, going to both the Aldgate and the Golders Green restaurants. But Beverly, if you're able to just give us a little bit about your front cover there.
First of all, thank you for coming and giving me the opportunity to talk. I've worked with Pam now for this is the third book, and she's great to work with. She has such detail, and she delivers. When she says something, she delivers, and I try to deliver. And being an artist that deals with identity through social history, and particularly as a Jew, we work so well together. So when we started on this work on blooms, I had just a cover to try and attract people to that story, and because it's so detailed, what do you select, what you don't select is the hard part. So, bit close, sorry. So what I wanted to do was, I did it in wood, so this is engraved in wood. It's the past when he came from Lithuania into Brick Lane, and then the colour part is really the activity, so that you get, your eye goes straight to the activity, but it's not in isolation to the history. So I wanted also, so he comes through from the docks, but Bloom's was very much part of Petticoat Lane. It was very much part of that area. So, and even the pictures in Bloom's itself was in the restaurant. The Petticoat Lane was in the restaurant. So I wanted to merge it together. So you can see, as I've done it, I've merged it together. I also wanted to put about the manufacturing and the fact that it went all over Britain with their Viennas and salamis, and you can see that's why I put that there. So it gets a balance between him arriving, starting as a butcher, then becoming a restaurant owner, and then becoming a manufacturer which travelled all over Britain. So those are the links. But if you look at the picture, there are other little bits that I wanted to twig. So one was the woman that sold bagels outside the shop. She became quite an icon in the East End. Also, if you talked so much about the waiters, and if you look, the waiters are larger than life in the picture. They're out of proportion, and that was also the psychological thing. So as an artist, you're not only dealing with facts, you're dealing with emotions. So it's to create that atmosphere, I emphasise that. And also he's spilling the food over them. So that is, as you can see. The other is the queuing up for the salt beef sandwiches. And I wanted to get that in. And then the continuation of Gold is Green. So there was this sort of thing. Also the jiggler, the entertainment that went on in the queues outside while people were queuing up to get into the restaurant. So within that story, I had a lot to get in that I wanted to put together, and yet you don't want to overload it. So that's why I concentrated on the bit on the main part, but the history also was relevant, but that's not so much in your face, so that's etched on the wood. So this is the original, and I thought it would be nice for you to see it. And thank you, Pam, for giving me the opportunity to produce this work.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful to hear from the artist herself there. As Beverly Jane was mentioning as well, the Bloom's did sort of expand, didn't it, beyond its restaurants. It had the ability to manufacture products and canned goods, and suddenly everyone in the UK could have a bit of Bloom's, couldn't they?
Its reach was absolutely ginormous. I was sort of incredulous at some stage, realising how far the produce went. It not just kind of went out up to kind of Scotland and beyond into Ireland, but at one stage also to Singapore, to Ghana and to Gibraltar. And not just into people's homes, but in every aspect of their life, really. I was told about people that didn't have a picnic without Bloom's, and you might be aware that the Jewish hotels in Bournemouth feasted on Bloom's produce. The ambassador in particular became known as Bloom's on Sea because there was so much of Bloom's food eaten there. So it was very much part of life. The irony, though, I think, is that as the manufactured goods took off big time and became a convenience food, it started to detract from the restaurants. People no longer had to kind of make the trek to to go to either Aldgate or to Golders Green. They could eat it at any time, wherever they were. It was a convenience food.
Now, like with every sort of story, and actually we talked about this a little bit when we did the Bournemouth book as well. You know, Bournemouth, it had its heyday, there was the golden age, everyone was going to the hotels, you know, all the Jews were in Bournemouth, and then bit by bit began to decline and times were changing. And the same thing happened, didn't it, to Bloom's as well. Over time, it just sort of declined. Let's just go over to page 325. They did attempt to sort of change themselves and adapt. You know, and they tried to sort of move with the times, possibly a bit too late. But I've just got a quote here, page 325. Philip Bagel sort of recalls some of the changes that Bloom's made towards the end. I remember that at some point, shortly before the closure of the restaurant, some bright spark had the idea of bringing the menu more up to date and to include some healthy options. Mysterious words never before seen or heard within those hallowed walls suddenly appeared on the menu. Terms like side salad and greens were now up there on a par with schmaltz and chopped chicken livers. I remember asking the waiter innocently, "What happened to the kishka?" He replied, "Oh, that stuff isn't considered healthy anymore, sir, and we've decided to take it off the menu." It was the same with the roast stuffed breast of lamb and all the other high cholesterol delicacies, which, although they could be the harbingers of your next heart attack, were the only reason why anyone chose to come to Bloom's in the first place. Ironically, the time at which Bloom's rushed to embrace healthy eating was exactly the point when the slow death of the restaurant began.
So what about the reasons why we lost Bloom's? It's not a single factor. It's much more complicated than that. And if I mention just a few, the first is about the role of the Bloom's family. A little while ago, I mentioned how important they were in the Bloom's story. That they were integral to its success, generated customer loyalty and staff loyalty, and so on. And for many generations, the Bloom's family were very they're very close, and they were kind of a really good team. They had complementary skills and things, and this was really important in keeping the business together. But over time, the family started to come apart a little bit, particularly after the death of key members of the family. And I think that the fact that the family were not as strong as they were at the beginning was one of the key factors in the demise of Bloom's. A second one is, perhaps not so obvious, is that Bloom's had made a really important part in helping the Jewish community to integrate into the mainstream by providing an anchor where they could go and be Jewish at a time when they were assimilating very rapidly. But by helping them to do that assimilation, they actually outlived their usefulness. They were kind of victim of their own success in a way. By helping to create that successful Jewish community, they were no longer needed, particularly as one generation followed another, and the kind of links to the East End and the kind of image that Bloom's loved to promote became less and less relevant. Another factor is the one that you've just touched on, was about a failure to modernise at a time when it mattered. I conclude that actually, yes, they did modernise in the end, but it was a bit too little, too late, really. There were times at which perhaps, like the factory, could have invested in new technology and machinery. I don't know if people were aware that at one time the canning machine broke down and all hell broke loose because people could no longer have their canning goods. And there was a kind of quite a sort of a lot of publicity about the failure to invest in new machinery. And I think the same was true also in the restaurants as well. Perhaps if they'd modernised a bit earlier in terms of not just the food but the ambience as well, it might have helped a little bit.
Okay, and I guess that sort of brings us towards, the sort of the demise, as it were. I remember reading, I can't remember, maybe it was in the Times or somewhere, declaring Bloom's was over, that was it. I mean, does anyone else remember that moment where they said, oh, this is it, this is the end, Bloom's has closed its doors? It was quite a sort of I remember it being quite a sort of a shocking thing. And then the next emotion that hit me was, well, when was the last time I went there? And then when I started speaking to everyone else about it, they all had exactly the same sentiment as myself, which was, well, we didn't go there. It's such a shame it's closed, isn't it? But we didn't go there. It was kind of that feeling. Pam, what do you think Bloom's will be most kind of remembered for? Because we remember it fondly, don't we? But it did come to its end. What do you think we will remember it for?
I think the very Jewish atmosphere. It was a very Jewish place. It was loud and it was noisy. And everybody tells me about it wasn't the place to go on a romantic date. And the emphasis was on a kind of quick service. You were in and out. And I came across this lovely quote which I'd like to share with you. The noise at Bloom's restaurant was so extreme that you could stand up and sing an operatic aria without attracting any attention, which I think really kind of sums it up. Beverly Jane, you mentioned the queues, and when I talk to people, everybody mentioned the queues. In sense of they're almost like an extension of the restaurant, that you met everybody you knew standing in the Bloom's queue, and you even got fed while you were there as well. And if you hit the right moment, you got entertained as well. Does anybody remember the most famous Bloom's waiter, Lou Dean? He had a fine singing voice, and he used to go out occasionally and entertain the people waiting outside to go in. What interested me as a historian was how little, actually, when I look back over my notes, my recordings and the posts on the social media, etc., is how little people actually mentioned what they ate. They talked about the size and the amounts and what was happening around them, the other people, the other characters, but they rarely mentioned in detail what it was they ate, except for the new green. Can anybody describe the new green for me? It was a type of cucumber, I understand, but I never did understand why that particularly stood out in people's memories associated with Bloom's.
Well, I think that brings us sort of neatly towards the end of our meal, as it were, is a metaphor. But we're happy to do some Q&As. All right.
Just before we go to the Q&A, just remember the book signing session will be upstairs. We'll be going up to set that up shortly. We'll give Pam about a couple of minutes while we get everything sorted out down here, and then we'll take you upstairs. Okay, there's still plenty of food left, so do help yourself to food at the end. Okay, so we're going to start the Q&A now. So we've got time for questions to around about 25 past. If you could keep your questions brief and to the point, that'd be really helpful. So I'm going to come around with a mic, and if you stand up.
Hi there, thank you, Pam. The reason I'm here is my father was a salt beef maker.
Oh, right.
At Bloom's in East London.
Oh, which one was it?
My father was the salt beef maker at Bloom's, and my question actually is did you touch on Bloom and Sturgis? Because in my lifetime, I was too young to know when he was at Bloom's, but heard all the stories. So for me, it was Bloom and Sturgis in Baker Street. as opposed to the one in East End or Golders Green.
Yeah, can I just check, is my mic
Yeah.
working? Okay. There's a big story there, thank you for bringing that out. So Bloom and Sturgis were not actually part of the Bloom's firm. Yeah. So Bloom and Sturgis was actually run by a nephew of Maurice Bloom, and actually it was quite a falling out. There was a lot of publicity because Monty, as he was the owner, started publicising himself as M. Bloom Kosher restaurant, and this seemed like it was trading on the very famous restaurant in the East End. So I think even at one point an injunction was taken out to stop this kind of adverse publicity. But that was the connection. Monty Bloom was actually a nephew of Maurice Bloom. Thank you.
So I have a question about another element that maybe should have been a chapter in the book, but is certainly a myth, which is the bill.
Yes.
Is it true that the waiters bought the food from the kitchen and sold it, or is that just a myth?
It's absolutely a myth. It was when I was interviewing people, every single person told me that story. But when I interviewed a lot of friends, families of waiters, of past Bloom's waiters, they said no, that actually wasn't the case. They were paid a wage and they got their tips, and that's how they made their money. However, I do explain in the book how I think it came about. There was something called the booking system, that as the waiters ordered the food, a note was taken of what they'd ordered, and as it came out of the kitchen, it was noted against the particular waiter's name, and the reason was it was a sort of kind of checking, if you like, so that the Bloom family knew at the end of the evening how much a particular waiter had to hand across, because in those days there were kind of no cash tills or anything like that. The waiters took the money and then later passed it on to the Blooms. So it was a myth. It's a really good story, but it's not true.
One question, or rather a comment, first of all, about the Trade Descriptions Act. You referred to people dining at Bloom's. I don't think anybody dined at Bloom's. We all went for a fress. You know, I think
Yeah, absolutely.
The question, though, most important for me, who has the recipes?
Oh, that is really interesting, because I don't know whether they were kept by the family, but certainly I think they were replicated after Bloom's closed. There were a whole tranche of ex-Bloom's people, both waiters and salt beef sandwich makers, etc., who went on to open salt beef sandwich bars. And I think they probably took with them both the recipes that they'd learnt in Bloom's and also the way in which the products were displayed. Has anybody been to B&K either? I think what they market there is a strong resemblance to what was sold at Bloom's, and also the way in which it's displayed. But I think rather than that being negative, I think it's quite a legacy from Bloom's that we still get their food via the people who learned their skills working at the firm.
We've still got time for questions. If anybody... Yep. Would you like to hold it quite close to the people at the back in here?
Hi, thanks for your talk, it's wonderful. Do you know anything about an alleged brandishing of a pistol in the Whitechapel branch around 1966? Something to do with the Crays and Barbara Windsor?
I don't, but it sounds a great story. How did I miss that? Let me answer that and tell you about another story which sort of equals it, really. The Crays at one point had an office upstairs in Bloom's. And they brought a lot of their friends along to eat in Bloom's, and I would suggest that they probably didn't pay a bill afterwards. So I don't know that particular story, but it sounds like it might be true, given that they were very present. But an equal story to that is that at one point there was a team of 4 chefs, and one of them was a Polish man named Sid, and he was a very good chef. And people really liked his produce. But on one occasion, Mrs. Bloom went to the back and she said, "Sid, somebody said your simmies are too salty." And he shouted at the top of his voice, too salty? I'll give her too salty. And he picked up a carving knife and proceeded to leave the kitchen to sort this woman out. But somehow death was averted. So things did happen in Blooms.
We do have time for a couple of more questions. If anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to put your hand up.
Mark, can I bring in Martin here, who's sitting in the front row? Martin Mellon is a member of the Blooms family, and I work really hard with him, and I'm very grateful for his insights. Did you want to say something?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Maurice Bloom's grandson, and was involved with Pam pretty much from the beginning. And if anyone's got any questions, because I guess I know more about this book than anybody here, or stories they'd like to relate, anything, I'm happy to. By the way, the Crays always did pay for their meals, but they never had to queue up.
I just wanted to say that my sister worked there. She was the cashier for Blooms, Rochelle Richards.
Oh, Rochelle.
Yeah, I thought you might know her. We know all the
sister?
secrets. It's my sister, my younger sister.
Oh, okay.
And Michael, well, I won't say any more. Give away all your secrets.
We'd be here a long time if you did, yeah.
I know. But it's true about the waiters. They would have to pay, and Betty would take the money because she didn't trust anyone in the restaurant.
Yes.
We were all thieves, she said.
Well, the waiters never trusted each other, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But I think, when Pam was talking about the staff that works in Blooms, I grew up with them, and
yes,
it was kind of weird that my family were working there. I mean, I worked there in the 70s and 80s, on and off. But I grew up with these waiters and counter staff and chefs and whatever. They were my extended family for many, many, many years. They all came to my bar mitzvah, which was a long time ago. And
family. We were one
I think the reason why Blooms sort of had a unique place, was because of that family. I think a lot of the customers picked up on that as well, yeah.
This is your opportunity to ask someone another question. We've still got time for a couple of questions. Yep, coming over.
Oh, by the way, Mark Boland's father works as a delivery driver for Blooms for a short. Mark, I forgot to tell Pam. So I'm telling you now.
Second edition. Hi. Was there any competition for Blooms in its heyday?
Well, we soon got rid of them. That's what the Crays were for.
That's what the Crays were for. I don't want to say that.
I think, throughout the ages, and particularly when, the mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe came over to the East End, lots of places tried opening up, but, there were many bakers and fish shops and things like that from Petticoat Lane and all around there, and everybody kind of found their own niche. And I think the reason my grandfather Maurice felt so attached to that business was that he had worked, in the food industry in Lithuania, if you can call it an industry. When he came over, like all of our descendants, I guess, he earned 3 shillings a week working for a butcher and sent half of it home to his parents. And, you somehow got by, and to me it seems like a completely vanished world, something that we can't relate to anymore. But I think the way Pam has brought, the history to life is quite important. Yeah, and I think just quickly, another story that I remember that actually was true was that after the war, when the Allies discovered all the Nazi papers and files and secrets, Bloom's Corner got quite a big mention in it because it was a meeting place for all the Jewish communist radicals who escaped from, Eastern Europe and used to meet in Bloom's and on that corner. Sort of one of their hit lists, that they were going to bomb. I mean, they destroyed the whole of the East End anyway, as you know. But Bloom's Corner, in particular, was, a very high-profile target for the Germans because they knew, all these sort of influential Jews, at that time were there. Incidentally, of course, Jack the Ripper committed his first murder in Gunthorpe Street, which was about 5 yards away from where the restaurant was. So, we get sort of hordes of American tourists coming in every Sunday after doing the Jack the Ripper tour, which I believe is still very popular these days. But, they don't go to Bloom's anymore, unfortunately, which is now a KFC, ironically. But that's another story.
We've got time for one more question.
Okay, just a really quick one. Was it ever considered, instead of letting Bloom's die and come to its natural end, that maybe the grandchildren, like yourself, would relaunch it and take it over and do something new with it?
Well, fortunately, I, somehow, sort of in my life after working in Bloom's, I developed a brain of my own and decided that it really wasn't going to be for me. And I think as time passed by, and as Pam pointed out, everything comes to an end. And actually, for a restaurant, a food business to last 90 odd years, you're not going to find many, that go through 3 generations. I think Bloom's did very well as it did, given the changes in society and culture and Jewish people moving out to the suburbs, I mean, I remember my parents telling me the suburbs when they grew up was Stamford Hill, Clacton, now it's Bushy and Radlett and Godlets and Albans and God knows where else. So, making restaurants pay these days is very difficult, and food manufacturing, there's a lot of difficulties involved, so I don't think it was ever seriously considered. My cousin Jonathan, who some of you may know since he became a star on Gogglebox, did try to keep it going for a little while, but the restaurant that he opened in Edgware wasn't really, because he fell between the 2 stools that Pam was talking about in terms of modernising and having, forbidden words like, forbidden words weren't like trafe and ham and things like that. As you say, they were salad and cabbage and calorie counts on each meal and things like that. So I think it reached its natural course. Nostalgia is not always what it used to be, as they say.
I think we ought to give a massive round of applause. I think we might get Fatin and Pam to have a little one last quote to end this session on, if possible, please, and then we'll call it a wrap.
What quote would you like, Pam? Should we do some more of the jokes?
Okay, this is one I found in a book. I don't know if people remember the Rothschild buildings that used to be in the East End of London. And it just told me so much about the sort of role that Bloom's played. Bloom's had their place on the corner of Old Montague Street. And on Monday, they'd have the offcuts of the worst from the weekend all different kinds of wurst. You see, like salami, you'd either fry the wurst or some would have it cold. They were delicious. Oh God, you thought you were so wealthy if you'd had some of that. And sometimes you would get the little sausages like Viennas. You thought you were the tops if you bought those. And that kind of really encapsulates how Bloom's helped people to acclimatise to a new country, and how it actually made them feel warmer about being here. It's a very strong quote, that one.
I've got another one, obviously from the waiter section. Norman Bookbinder had a sort of an explanation as to why there was such a rapid service. And that was something else actually we didn't mention, wasn't it? It was the rapid service, and it was also the rapid clearing up. Does everyone remember that? I remember them sort of sweeping around my feet before I'd even finished. And I remember that as a child, so that was clearly something stuck in my head.
Hang on to your cutlery.
Yeah, hang on to your cutlery, Pam said, yeah. So here we go. If a customer sat down and ordered a rib steak, Lou Dean told him he couldn't have one. He'd say something like, "Oh sir, you don't want the steak this week. I had a steak for lunch yesterday and it broke my teeth." This was because serving a steak would have meant him going back into the kitchen and telling the chef to prepare a rib steak. There would then have been a delay while the chef put the steak under the grill and waited for it to cook. As a result, Lou would only have been able to serve one set of customers in an hour, when he wanted really to serve 2 people so he could get 2 tips. He therefore always encouraged customers to have the salt beef, which was ready on the block and could be served up in 2 minutes. It's just another sort of one of those lovely stories, isn't it, about Bloom's, the Bloom's experience. I think that's what we took away with us, apart from the salt beef sandwiches. We sort of took away the emotion, didn't we, of being in Bloom's. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for coming today.